Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the H+C webinar. The title of the webinar is Cooling in Indian Homes. I'm Dr. Andy Smallbone. I'm an associate professor at Durham and I'm the Network Plus lead. This event is organised through the EPSRC Network Plus for the decarbonisation of heating and cooling, and is part of a series looking at different challenges of decarbonising our heating and cooling sector and behaviour. This month, we're delighted to welcome two speakers from Heriot-Watt University to talk about the research in assessing energy demand reduction and decarbonisation of cooling in India. We're really grateful to both presenters for providing their time. We will now move to Andrew Peacock. Andrew is an associate professor in the School of Energy, Geoscience, Infrastructure and Society at Heriot-Watt. His research interests include renewable energy generation, energy management, and energy efficiency in buildings, and he is a co-I of this network. Andrew will be talking about dispatchable air conditioning in Indian homes in a DAC, which I thought initially was direct air capture, but it obviously isn't that. It's dispatchable air conditioning in Indian homes.
Okay, thanks very much for inviting me. It's a delight to speak to you all. I work in the same department as David, and we collaborated in both these projects. The DAC project was funded by Innovate. It involved partners in India, so Outable Consulting, who are a consultant. Outable was the base for it as well, for the pilot trial. EDS are a consultancy working out of Delhi, do a lot of policy work with Indian government and with state governments. FIRE are an organisation in Scotland who we work with extensively on field trial management, and SEEN are a consultancy in Edinburgh that look at kind of socio-economic rollout of low carbon solutions, if you like, in communities. It was our COVID project. I guess many of us have had a COVID project. The project was wholly kind of disrupted by COVID. The objective was to quantify, whereas David's talked about a kind of modelling and assessment approach, we were tasked with actually designing a control platform to curtail AC operation and explore the extent of which that curtailment could alleviate grid management problems, so reduce load, reduce energy consumption, and also what would be the kind of impact on thermal comfort in the dwellings in which we did that. As I say, we were wholly disrupted by COVID. We onboarded and had kick-off meetings in March 2020. So I caught the last plane going west out of Chennai after those kick-off meetings. And all of our field trial activity took place during COVID, so everything had to be done remotely, both remotely in the dwellings. So we had to leave bags at the door for people to install smart plugs themselves. So it kind of curtailed a little bit the scope of the exercise that we wanted to do. 30 dwellings were fitted with smart plugs. It allowed us to access the demand data from the AC unit. It allowed us to interrupt it so we could switch it on and off. It also allowed us to mess about with set points, although we didn't do that just because it was too difficult. We were going to install dedicated communications with the systems, so our own. We were going to move everything off of SIM cards, but it was just too difficult to install that in dwellings. So everything came off customer Wi-Fi, and I'm sure many of you work with projects with customer Wi-Fi before, and it kind of disrupts data flows. Outable was the location. So Outable is, for those of you who know India, it's about a 4-hour drive south of Chennai in southern India. So climate on the coast near Pondicherry, and all 30 dwellings were within a 5-kilometre radius. Just a bit of context, we accessed 30 years climate data for the region. We were interested in some of the comments that were coming back from the workshops that we had. That they were seeking to access AC systems because it was just getting too hot. So as David says, in this community, the use of AC was eschewed, if you like, for sustainability reasons, but people were starting to access it because they were just saying it was getting too hot. So we wanted to analyse that. What this graph just shows is using Moran's environmental stress index. Each box represents a day of the year, and we can see 30 years of data on this. Where it's yellow, it's showing a more extreme environmental stress index. So towards the right hand, from 2014 onwards, we can start to see much more yellow appearing. and that growth in the summertime climate. So they kind of felt the feelings of people were reflected in how the data was turning out. As David says, the other context is in forecasted massive growth in AC systems. A lot of this stimulated by policy to a certain extent, obviously also by economic condition. But there are policies in the Indian Cooling Action Plan to try and deliver thermal comfort for all, for instance. The changing climate in India, to some extent, makes some form of mechanical cooling a necessity in many of the dwellings in India from a health perspectives. As you can see, dramatic rises. I mean, just really, really crazy rises that are going to really stress the Indian grid if nothing is done if it's all fit and forget, if nothing is done to manage rollout of these systems. Obviously, climate is a forcing factor. We were able to access some data from Delhi here for a single feeder, just to try and understand where EC systems are currently running. And cooling is currently been affecting the grid. So this is a single feeder, about 685 dwellings on this feeder, showing each dot showing average electricity consumption on that feeder. And you're able to discern with a monsoon and a dry cooling forcing temperatures, them different associated with how much humidity is in the air in the monsoon and the dry season. So getting up to around 25 kilowatt hours per dwelling. So there are many areas in Indian cities where you're starting to see Western style consumption levels, although nothing as big as what we're seeing in Florida, which is shown as a kind of context here. From the data that we analysed from the dwellings that we monitored in India, we were able to start to discern cooling personas, which was interesting to us. We can see here aggregate or average dwelling electricity consumption derived from aggregate data, where in March we see very little AC consumption, mainly concentrated around night times, a little bit in the afternoon, and that growing, as one might expect, as the cooling season becomes more severe towards mid-May, which is peak cooling season in Heriot-Watt. We were able to kind of poke about inside these average data to start to see different personas, so how people transition from that onset of a cooling season into peak season. And we could see these types of arrangements where we had daytime extenders. We had people who extended it from daytime usage to daytime and nighttime. We had nighttime extenders, so they never used it during the day, they only used it to help with sleep. And then we had people who at peak season had the AC system on continually through the day. The middle two, the daytime to nighttime and the nighttime extenders, the biggest groups. So what do we do in our control platform? So our control platform, the curtailment method, the methodology that we alighted upon, as I say, largely we had all sorts of ideas in the outset of this that we would use sort of MPC approaches where we would be doing a lot of heavy data analysis of incoming data to try and understand how people were using their AC systems and then try and control them almost discreetly in each dwelling. That was all made very, very difficult because of data issues associated with using customer Wi-Fi. So we came up with a much more lightweight way of proceeding. What we did is we split the day into periods, and each period then into a series of 5 episodes. And we randomly assigned each household to a cooling class. And each cooling class had a severity of curtailment. So we had in the example shown here, we played about with this a little bit, but in the example shown here, we had 3 different cooling classes. The first one had curtailment in 2 out of the 5 episodes. The most extreme one had curtailment in 3 out of the 5 episodes, and cooling class 3 just rode through, had no curtailment at all. And then the cooling class, as I say, dictated the severity of the cooling constraint. In each of the red blocks, we switched the AC system off. That's what we did. We had to analyse how we went about doing this to try and overcome local control management issues with the AC systems themselves. So it was obviously, when you switch an AC system off, it cools down for a period of time before you can switch it back on again. So that kind of led to how long each of these episodes were, and therefore how long the periods were. So analysing the AC systems that we found in the participating residents, we found that an 8-minute period allowed that for that cooling down period. So we had 5 8-minute periods, therefore our episodes were 8-minute episodes, and 5 in each period. The periods were therefore 40 minutes in duration. So we ran this for a period of time. As I say, we played about with it a bit, different curtailment types. Of the example just shown, this was the results of the pilot trial on the AC consumption load for the participating dwellings. We were not able to run the system during daylight hours. The Outerville is, as David mentioned, is an intentional eco-village. It's invested heavily in PV systems in its grid, and during the daytime, when there was a lot of PV generation on the go, the grid got pretty dirty. So we got lot of voltage instability, and many of the AC systems that were installed with inverters had voltage management on them. So they were effectively self-curtailing when the voltage went outside certain limits. So we were unable to discern the extent at which that curtailment was because of what we were doing or because of what the grid itself was imposing. So we only looked at periods between 6 p.m. at night and 6 a.m. in the morning. The blue line is the forecasted baseline that we extracted from having periods where we weren't curtailing at all. So we were able to construct models of what we would expect to see when we were curtailing. So we had quite significant reductions in demand for the periods that we were operating. So overall, in terms of quantification, what we saw was a reduction in energy consumption of 21%. We can see a period of about 14 days here between the 19th and the 2nd of June. There's a couple of days hidden within that, where we didn't do any curtailment at all. So that was us just kind of filling up our baseline data to make sure that our models of baseline data were kept consistent with the climate as it moved through the cooling season. In terms of load reduction average, we were seeing load reductions of about 23%. And in a number of the dwellings, we were able to extract thermal comfort data. And what we were seeing was about a 1 degree increase in thermal comfort envelope, if you like. So the thermal comfort envelope widened by about a degree across the dwellings that we were monitoring. So if you like the quid pro quo, we were getting something in the region of 20% reductions in energy and power for a 1 degree sacrifice in thermal comfort condition. It was interesting also, some of the data we were able to start to look at how responsive the buildings were. So we could see fast, medium and slow responses. The graph here is just showing the impact of at different temperatures, external to outside, how much temperature gain you could see in the building in 20 minutes when you switch the AC system off. Some of these buildings were extremely responsive, that associated with building fabric, but also associated with behaviour, with particularly with respect to ventilation in each of these dwellings. One of the other issues you have with an aggregated system like this, where you're trying to have participation of demand response from a wide variety of people to the benefit of the grid, is that you will start to see free riders. So we can see the proportion of dwellings that were participating in any block of demand reduction. And there are a significant rump of dwellings, 20-30%, that don't participate at all. So when you're trying to rationalize the benefits of a demand response program of this nature, you have to start asking questions about what happens. How are you going to manage that free rider component when you're distributing the benefits associated with implementation of this type of program? We also got involved in a number of behavioural exercises. Some of them were kind of shared behavioural evaluations with the CEDRI project you just heard about. It was interesting with respect to the way in which the kind of deeply held sustainable pro-environmental value held by many of the residents, or indeed all of the residents in Outerville, started to defray as we moved through the cooling season. So they started to eschew in pro-environmental behaviours, that being manifested, if you like, by minimising energy consumption. And what overtook that was a requirement to have situational problems solved, i.e. it got very, very hot and I need to have cooling, thank you very much. So we saw quite a lot of that, and that was also reflected in workshop activity that we had. As I say, we saw it in the data as well. The other workshops that we did workshops both with stakeholders. So we did workshops in Delhi with stakeholders who may be responsible for rollout of demand response programs, and also with the householders themselves. So it was interesting to see how demand response was viewed from a kind of practitioner's perspective and a householder's perspective. With respect to practitioners, I think they were all in belief that this was the technology that was required. So a degree of saviorism there. There was a lot of dispute as to how exactly it would be rolled out in the future in terms of a DR program. In terms of householder, so we've done work like this in the UK around demand response programs around heating and appliance in residences as well, and also trying to encourage self-consumption of renewable energy. We saw similar types of kind of behavioural response to demand response in India with the community as we've seen in the UK, largely around trust associated with the organisation that's running the DR programme, and also a feeling of loss of agency of decision-making in the home, and a kind of worry about people reaching into the home and demanding behaviour or changes in habits and practices, and the trust element around the organisation that might be requesting that way forward. So EDS did a bit of modelling around placing a demand response programme of the type you see with the results that we achieve against other ways of trying to manage demand. So that would maybe around installing electrical storage, behind meter electrical storage, to try and allow peak shaving or management of load in that manner. Combining that with PV so that you've got a bit of input from non-grid electricity, and other methods of curtailment all the way up to mandatory DR standards. And their kind of modelling of the DR approaches found it to be very cost effective. But I think that their conclusions, as one might expect, is that cooling, to manage the scale of cooling increase that's going to be in India, will require a basket of solutions. And some examples of them are shown on the chart. Just a word about regulation. So we did look at, we worked with ESL and with the national government in Delhi to explore options for regulation of AC system. It's quite a hot topic in India. And obviously one of the problems with regulation is just the length of time it takes to do it. It's interesting to look at the 4755 standard in Australia, which kind of started its genesis, if you like, its discussions in 2004. And even today has not arrived at a satisfactory description of how that demand response mandate will roll out towards Australian AC systems. So it's mandated that they have to be demand response ready, the AC systems in Australia, but the way in which that demand response programme is going to operate to actually deliver real results has not been concluded yet. And most of the pilot activity around the way in which that demand response mandate is currently described in regulation does not save anything like the energy or power that they were expecting it to. So it's a long burn. So just some final thoughts to conclude. As I mentioned, regulation should be supported. That's not to assure that regulation isn't needed in this area, both from the perspective of energy efficiency and indeed mandated demand response activity, but it's a tortoise and it's certainly not the hare. And while that regulation time period is going forward, we're going to see substantial increases in non-DR ready AC system adoption in India. So in the meantime, what can be accomplished? Well, you could fast track trusted approaches for ensuring measurement and prediction forward so that demand response, bespoke locational demand response programs can start to be implemented. That might be at the level of development. So we talked a lot to developers of housing systems in India, and they were very open to the idea that they could start to put DR systems into AC that they were installing in those developments. But overall, policymakers, grid operators, and utility program designers need to start to explore how they can unlock flexibility as a core asset value within overall system planning. But kind of overarching all of that is a requirement to see very innovative methods of consumer engagement to make sure that we're bringing consumers with the innovation so that as it lands, it's adopted and fully trusted and used to its maximum value. So that's everything from me. Thanks very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew.